If you're a reflective person in the world today, it's impossible not to notice that we are surrounded by conspiracy theories, that the internet is making it a lot more difficult for us to come to a collective consensus, that information is kind of being fragmented into so many different factions, different worldviews that reinforce each other through just so many separate news channels and paradigms and social media feeds that create just all these fragmented separate worlds that we're seeing in a lot of conflict with each other right now. And so a lot of people are talking about cognitive biases, which psychologically would be the way that we sort of fail to process reality, fail to process information accurately, and start to create just realities, experiences of reality that are based on constructs of our own perception, of our own biases, that we're not seeing things as they are, that we're starting to convolute facts into narratives that start to really diverge from, really separate from reality. And so then we end up, personally in an echo chamber where each of us is seeing narratives that reflect our own biases, and so strengthening our biases. And collectively, if we're all doing that, we end up unable to relate to each other, to anyone who's outside of that echo chamber, because their version of the truth diverges just so drastically from ours now that we don't even have a common ground to start a conversation. So this idea of a bias is something that we often, in a modern context, try to correct with facts. We say that, we need to be better informed. We need the right information. And that's true on a surface level. Yes, that's relatively true that when we start to create fantastical versions of reality, we do diverge from obvious facts that, someone who's looking on the surface, like a scientist or political scientist or a social scientist who's looking at what's really happening here, let's just write down the facts, is going to see, okay, what you're saying does not coincide with the reality that I am observing objectively. So we are diverging from facts, but clear perception is more than just programming ourselves properly. If you just stick to all the facts and you're very rational, you're still not perceiving reality clearly. And I think that's something that we often miss in a modern discussion of clear perception, that we think that clear perception is about being logical, about having the right information and being logical. Okay, yes, that is clearer than having the wrong information and being completely irrational, sure. But there is a much deeper clarity than just logical processing, which is something like a robot. I mean, that image of clarity is like the clarity of a well-programmed robot. And surely as humans, we are more than robots. So on a deeper level, this observation that the mind tends to create biases and tends to create illusions is something that's been observed for thousands of years across various cultures. In Hinduism, this was called Maya, which is illusion, that it's kind of built into the way that we perceive things to distort reality and to perceive kind of our own version of things. And that's basically the root of conflict for humans, is that we are all in these unconscious biases and versions of reality that we're kind of just acting out upon each other. And it just creates this big tangled mess of samsara, of suffering. But the root of that is in the structure of the mind itself. And on the deepest level, you can say just the fact that we perceive the world in small permanences, that the mind imagines things as solid because that's just how it functions, that the mind imagines a world that's constantly changing, that's constantly impermanent. It imagines it as just a series of permanent pieces. That itself is an illusion. So the structure of our mind itself does not coincide with reality, because by the nature of the mind, we don't have a choice but to understand things as solid pieces. We can conceptually understand that they'll change, but when we conceptualize, when we imagine something, we imagine it as fixed. If we talk about a fact, we have to talk about it as fixed. Otherwise, we can't. We have nothing to talk about. We have to imagine an entity. We can even discuss that entity is in flux, but we're still speaking about a fixed thing, even if we acknowledge that it's changing. That's just how our mind works. So in the structure of the mind itself, there's just a dissonance from the way that reality is working. Reality is never fixed. No piece of reality is ever fixed. It's always shifting. If you refer to Conor, who's speaking right now, tomorrow I'm going to be subtly different than I am today. My body's changing all the time. Anybody who's seen these videos knows that my hair is always different. I'm definitely getting older. So even the idea of a Conor, like what's the Conor? Like where's the fixed me? It's always shifting, and the mind just can't really account for that. You can have a loose idea mentally of who I am because okay, yes, of course you're changing. But your mind still has to fixate. I mean, have some solid idea. That's just how our minds work. So that doesn't work very well for us inherently, because the mind is inherently out of touch with reality, even if it tries to keep up with new information and keep, adapting itself to the facts, the current facts. It's still just kind of like approximating and juggling and trying to be in touch, but the mind is never quite in touch. It can only kind of approximate reality. It can't actually perceive reality directly. So then we come to clear perception, which will not be found in the mind. You cannot perceive reality clearly through the mind. You can use the mind to dissect reality as an approximation, which is great for, building technologies and having conversations, but it's never going to be quite accurate. Whatever we perceive with our minds is not going to be fully accurate. It's always going to be, on some level, a cognitive bias, whatever we perceive with our minds and whatever we discuss with our minds. Even these words are just words, they're just concepts. There's no perfect way to communicate this because we're using language that has to be interpreted mentally. But beyond that, there is an inner experience of simple presence, of being here in this moment, of perceiving what is next to you, what is around you directly and immediately, just of plain experience. This is a totally irrational thing to say if you don't know what I'm talking about. But if you are quiet and feel within yourself, what is it to be here right now? What is this moment? Is there some beingness, some existence, some aliveness, some experience of this moment? You can feel that there is something within that's more essential than the mind and whatever the mind creates. And you can even start to challenge your own cognitive dissonance, your own cognitive biases, by feeling when there's strong emotion. So if you do have strong emotion around a certain issue, something that causes you to react strongly, what is it just to sit with that experience? So notice the emotion that arises. Notice the thoughts that arise around that particular issue, whatever it is. It could be in your personal life. It could be a collective political issue. What are you feeling there? And it's not to dismiss the feeling as false necessarily. It might not be a cognitive bias. It might be like a passionate feeling of justice or something. Who knows? You could be feeling so many things. But no matter what it is, just sitting with that experience and noticing it and letting it be and continuing to observe. pretty much everything that you will perceive will eventually dissolve into awareness. As you sit with it, as you're present, as you just notice and be, you'll find that all the sharp edges within you, all the narratives, kind of all the ideologies, whatever unconscious paradigm you're living through, starts to sort of dissolve in your awareness. It starts to be uprooted. And what's left more and more is just a direct perception of the reality around you. And the things around you just meet awareness rather than meeting like unconscious forms within you that then kind of play out on the forms around you, unconscious motivations and opinions and drives within you that are relating to everything around you. There's just more space of awareness, of the act of perception itself, of perceiving, of being, and then forms can just meet plain perception, and there's just a clearer vision of whatever is meeting awareness without your own kind of identified narrative that is meeting each thing. So that's a process of sitting with yourself on the deepest level. I say yourself, but I just mean that presence, that beingness, that space within you, and allowing each kind of narrative, each series of thoughts, each emotional experience just to happen and to have some space. So we're probably all living with cognitive biases. We're probably all living in delusion on some level. It is in the structure of our minds to be deluded. I mean, we're just not perceiving reality clearly. And very few of us on a collective level, on a global level still, are looking beyond the mind, are recognizing that, oh, the mind itself is delusional, and there's something more fundamentally lucid that we can get in touch with. But play around with that and notice that there's a softness to it too. If you do feel this presence and sort of a clarity, it's not the kind of thing that you're very inclined to like force on other people. Like, this is clarity. I think that clarity is more inviting in itself. You tend to be more fascinated with the internal experience than you are with kind of forcing it out into the world. It's more of a space than anything else. So see what you feel there. See if you notice that spaciousness within, and what it is to just sort of let each hard thing in you, each rigid thing in you, kind of open into that space and unmake itself. And see what deeper clarity you might come to.